for the inward corner, we should have 2 pattern pieces cut. The inward corner base pattern, cut 1 from muslin, and the inward corner pattern, cut 1 from contrast fabric. Make sure to transfer your stitching lines. This is a 1/2 inch seam allowance along these 2 edges, and make sure to clip your notches on the contrast piece. Same thing here on your base pattern cut from muslin. Be sure to transfer your stitching lines and clip your notches. I'm going to sew my tailor's tacks. There are 3 tailor's tacks on this pattern. I'm just going to do 3 quick little tailor's tacks. Just pull it through once, 1 single stitch, as I'm not going through multiple layers of fabric, just 1 layer of fabric. I'll do 1 tailor's tack stitch. One, 2, and 3. There are my 3 tailor's tacks, and here they are corresponding on the opposite side. I'm going to mark these little points with my friction pen, just so I know where those are. There we go. And I'm going to remove my pattern. Lift this up. Same thing here. I'll remove my pattern from my contrast fabric, so those are ready to go. I've already marked where my tailor's tacks are going to go, so I'm going to remove these. It's just a good way of transferring those marks to your fabric to ensure that everything is lining up properly. Now, what we want to do is sew this rectangle into this open cutout taken from our muslin. And we're going to end up sewing a seam, and this is why we call it an inward corner, because it's a corner going in towards our fabric. So assuming this is the right side of my muslin, make sure you've got your pieces oriented like this, and this is the right side of my contrast fabric. I can put my pieces right sides together. Let me see, there we go. Right sides together, matching up the raw edges, just like we normally do on a seam. There's my seam allowance, 1/2 inch right there. But when I get down to this corner here, suddenly my contrast fabric is going in one direction and my base fabric is going in another. So how do we get this fabric over here to go in another direction? We're gonna have to work our way around this corner and pull all of our excess fabric up and out of the way. But in order to allow us to pivot this part of our seam allowance over to here, we have to clip into our seam allowance. We're actually going to be cutting into our fabric in order to relieve tension right here to allow us to bend our seam allowance back. Now we could just go in there with a pair of scissors and just start snipping away, but we want to make sure that we don't end up with a hole in our fabric later on. So I'm just going to flip this over to the wrong side of my muslin so you can see my marks. Those 3 tailor's tacks are there for a reason. I'm going to go to the sewing machine and I'm going to sew from one tailor's tack to the corner, and I'm going to pivot and come back out at this other tailor's tack. So I'm just going to make one tiny little L shape, little right angle stitching with a number 1 stitch. So most of our seams we sew with a number 2 stitch because it's a little bit faster to sew, but a number 1 stitch is going to be smaller, tinier, tighter stitches. It's going to give us more flexibility, more dexterity, so we can more easily get into this corner, and it's going to be more stability for this inward corner, which we're then going to have to snip into. So our number 1 stitches are going to serve as kind of a gatekeeper. So we don't clip past it when we go to cut into our seam allowance. Those number 1 stitches will act as like a barrier between our actual seam and the cutting that we're going to do. It's good reinforcement for this corner. Now, number 1 stitches are great. They're very precise. They're nice and strong, but they are terrible to have to rip out. They are nigh on to impossible to rip out. You can rip them out in case there's a mistake, but they take almost twice as long to remove as a number 2 stitch would. So I don't want to have to remove my number 1 stitches. If I stitch out here, I think we mentioned earlier that anywhere from your stitching line to your raw edge is considered inside of the seam allowance. Anything from the stitching line out to the rest of the pattern is considered outside of the seam allowance. And anything we stitch on the inside of the seam allowance is not going to be seen on the final piece. So I'm lazy. I don't want to have to remove my reinforcing stitches, and I'd like to keep them in there just as added security that I don't end up with a hole. So I'm going to stitch, rather than from one point to the next, I'm going to go just inside, about a 1/16 of an inch inside of my seam allowance. So I'm going to start right about here. I'm going to go down to my corner and pivot here. So I'm not stitching right on top of these points. I'm going to stitch just inside, about a 1/16 of an inch inside on a number 1 stitch, no back tacking. So let's head to the machine and do that. Switching to a number 1 stitch on my machine. And I'm going to place my needle down 1/16 of an inch away from where my tailor's tack is. Again, my tailor's tack is over here and my needle is just beside it. And I'm going to work just alongside that line that I've marked till I get into my corner, and then I can stitch just beside those tailor's tacks. Number 1 stitch, no back tacking. I'm going to walk my stitches into that corner that's pretty close. I'll pivot my work. I think I can take one more stitch. So be careful to not go over my stitching line and pivot again. Once again, I still have my tailor's tack here and my needle is just beside that, and I will stitch just along there until I reach that next tailor's tack. So there is my reinforcing stitch just inside of my stitching line. So I shouldn't have to remove these stitches afterward. Okay, so we've got the start. Let's go back to the right sides of our pieces. So we have the orientation set up. Again, your notches should be matching up. You should have a notch along this edge and along this edge. So this is the orientation. If you accidentally spin this around, you're not going to find your notches. So just, if it doesn't work one way, flip it around and try it another way. Right sides together, matching up my notches. And I'm going to pin into this. And I'll pin down towards this corner here. Again, I'm pinning perpendicular to my stitching line. Now I can clip into this seam allowance on my base pattern. So let me zoom in here. There's my reinforcing stitches. There's the corner of my pattern. I'm just going to turn my work a little bit here. I'm going to clip towards this stitching. Do not clip through this stitching. Remember how we did like stay stitching on the skirt? We want to avoid clipping through the stitches that we just worked so hard to make. We should be able to clip very close, if not right up to those stitches without actually clipping through them. Again, we still want to keep those stitches there to act as security for our seam. But now we've got a lot more movement with our muslin fabric. And now I can pivot this work around and open it up completely to the opposite side. So remember, our original muslin looks like this, but we've got a seam allowance going out to the right, but this seam allowance is going out to my left. I can now pivot this all the way around and tuck my excess fabric up and out of the way. And now I've got a seam allowance here and a corresponding seam allowance to match with my piece here. Now I'm pinning everything with the contrast fabric facing up, but when I go to stitch, I am not going to be sewing with this side up. But this illustrates that pivoting that is available now that we've clipped into that corner. Just remember, when you're working on an inward corner on other garments, make sure you reinforce your seam before you go to open this up. I'm just going to flip my work over just so you can better see what's going on. This is where I'll be sewing. I'll be sewing from this side of my work, and I recommend you do the same, because when we get to the machine, we're not going to pin everything into place right now. We're going to actually go to the sewing machine and we're going to pivot this around as we're working. So I've got this pinned for right now. That's all ready to go. And I'm going to head to the machine and I'm going to start here and I'm going to stitch my way down on a number 2 stitch. Make sure to change your machine back to a number 2 stitch. Now a number 1 stitch is great for reinforcement, but it's not fun in case you have to rip everything out. I'm going to start on a number 2 stitch, back tack at the beginning. Stitch at a 1/2 inch seam allowance. And we're going to start getting towards this corner. We want to keep everything lined up until we get right into this corner where this little tailor's tack is. I'm getting close to that corner. I'm going to walk my stitches to make sure I can get my needle right down in that corner. There we go. So my needle is right in that tailor's tack. So this is locked down. My needle is in place. My needle is acting as a pin right now, holding both pieces of fabric together. I don't want that to move, but I am going to start moving my fabric. So make sure your needle is down in your work at that tailor's tack, because we don't want that to move. Lift your presser foot, hold on to this fabric back here, and then pivot your muslin fabric around. You're going to see excess fabric starting to form back here. That's totally fine. Pivot your work around and do your best to line up the raw edges of your muslin here. Right along here, we want to make sure that these 2 raw edges match up. We're going to get some of this excess fabric up and out of the way. We want to avoid getting any puckers or anything in here. I'm going to pivot my work. Still got my presser foot up. I'm going to pivot my work all at once, making sure all this excess fabric is up and out of my way. We can tuck that away so that's a nice smooth finish as we get across the rest of this stitching. Now you can pin this if you'd like. If you're not feeling confident being able to sew across this by just holding your work, you should have some corresponding notches down here. I'll show you that one more time. I don't want to put too much wear and tear on my fabric though. So we stitched all the way down and stopped at that tailor's tack. Keep your needle in your work, lift your presser foot, hold your contrast fabric under here, and pivot your muslin fabric. It's pushing everything out of the way. Pivot the muslin fabric, hold on to this contrast fabric, pivot the muslin fabric until it lines up at your seam allowance there. You can then pivot your work, pin this together, make sure your notches are matching up, and then just push the rest of this muslin fabric up and out of the way so it's not in your way. You shouldn't have too big of a lump or bump to have to sew over here. I've got a tiny little one here, but it should be fine once I press everything out. And I'm just going to continue stitching down the rest of this corner. And back tack at the end. So now we've kind of got a bunch of muslin fabric in the way here. If we open this up, you should see there's our inward corner, nice and clean finished. And here's what our seam allowances are looking like under here. Our muslin is clipped to allow us to turn that corner. So once more, we started down this edge, pivoted our fabric up and out of the way. It ended up kind of folding in this direction. And then we sewed down this side. When we open everything back up, there we go. Everything should be nice and lined up along the top and along the left-hand side. I'm going to turn this to the wrong side of my sample. And I want to press all of my seam allowance toward my muslin. It's going to reduce a lot more bulk if we press everything in one direction. So make sure you're giving it a nice top pull so everything is lying flat along that seam. Give it some steam. Give it a nice little tug. And then from the right side, I just want to check that corner. I don't want too much puckering. It should lay relatively flat once it's pressed. There's a bit of a pucker there, but let me hit that with some steam. It should straighten itself out. Again, we want to be stitching, we want to be pressing right along the seam edge. We don't want any excess fabric kind of rolling over itself or anything like that. And we should have a nice clean corner right down there. So that is our inward corner sample. You should have clipped seam allowance down here. I'm going to label my work. There we go, inward corner done.